Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Women Development Committee of Pillai Institute of Management Studies and Research, I, Paulumi Laha of first year MBA batch, welcome you all in today's webinar. Today's session is in association with Soroptimist International, Bombay Chamber. Now, I request Dr. Selina Joy, ma'am, Executive Committee member of SIBC and professor at our institute, to address the gathering. Over to you, ma'am.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. It's always a pleasure for Soroptimist International Bombay Chamber to partner with the Pillai Institute of Management Studies and Research on various projects, as it gives us the opportunity to extend our advocacy work among young management graduates. 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence is an international campaign to challenge violence against women and girls and runs every year from 25th November. And it ends on 10th December, which is Human Rights Day. The 2021 theme is Orange the World, End Violence Against Women Now. Gender-based violence is a human rights violation. It undermines a person's sense of self-worth and self-esteem. It affects not only the physical health, but also mental health and may lead to self-harm, isolation, among other problems. Freedom from violence is a fundamental human right. At SIBC, we do various activities throughout these 16 days to highlight these issues, especially among the youth. We're really grateful to Ayushi Kundu, a young Soroptimist who's made a global mark with her passion and dedication to spare her precious time to take this session for us. Also, I'd like to thank the WDC chairperson, Ms. Mamta Nair, who has given us this opportunity to spread our advocacy work. So without further ado, I know you're all waiting to hear Ayushi. So I'll just, hand over the proceedings back to the host. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. And we are also happy to have Dr. Daphne Pillai, ma'am, the founder, president of SIBC with us today.
Follow me. That's Dr. Daphne Pillai.
Daphne Pillai, sorry, ma'am.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So to deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity, said Nelson Mandela, an African human rights activist. The world today has recognized every human basic rights and celebrate International Human Rights Day every year. In order to commemorate this year's International Human Rights Day, which falls on 10th of December, the Women Development Committee of Pillai Institute of Management Studies and Research, in association with Soroptimist International Bombay Chamber, welcomes you all for today's webinar on the genesis of human rights law in India with special reference to women rights. Today, we have with us an eminent speaker who champions in the fields of human rights. We welcome Ms. Ayushi Kundu to address this gathering. Ms. Ayushi is a legal practitioner at Calcutta High Court and also a Soroptimist International President's Appeal Coordinator. She also has experience of project management, global communication, and leadership in international organizations dedicated to secure basic human rights of women and girls worldwide. Welcome, ma'am, and over to you.
Thank you, Paulumi. Thank you, Selina ma'am, for having me over today. It's a pleasure to be conducting this session and to be able to speak on the genesis of human rights in India with reference to women's rights. I'm very honored that Daphne ma'am is also present here today, and I hope I will not disappoint any of you through this session. So I'll begin right away. So if you could please share the slides.
Paulumi, you can mute.
Yes, I'm just sharing the slide, ma'am. 1 second.
And Paulumi, if you'd like to mute.
No, ma'am, it's Mamta ma'am doing sharing the slides.
Okay.
Please let me know if it is visible.
I'm not able to
Not
see it.
yet.
Okay.
Not yet, Mamta. Yes.
Yes. So yes, you can just start from here. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, once again. And as we speak about human rights and we start a discussion on human rights, it warrants a definition of the term, especially in the context of a rapidly changing world where new forms of human rights abuse seem to be mushrooming on a daily basis. And in a very loose sense, human rights can be defined as those very minimal rights which every person has the right to enjoy by virtue of being a member of the larger human beings family. The concept of human rights began with the start of civilization on earth, and it's not something that has just come up in the last 50 or 60 years. And human beings, in order to survive and live happily, need these forms of rights to smoothen out their lives. From the beginning of human history, man has struggled uh, for his existence against nature and for liberty, for freedom, and through these struggles man has attained basic freedom. These struggles have paved the way for human rights, and the most unique feature of human rights is the fact that it is so difficult to define, but it is almost impossible to ignore. Human rights again denotes all those rights which are inherent in our nature and without which we human beings cannot live. These rights are absolutely indispensable for the human dignity which human beings enjoy from birth to death. Next slide, please. Now, many principles of international human rights law have their roots in ancient societies and religions. Confucius, who was a Chinese scholar, is based, we have human rights law based around the thoughts of Confucius. And according to his beliefs, individuals in society are dependent on each other and are encouraged to show respect for all. This is a strong degree of family piety, and individuals are obliged to contribute towards a harmonious society. Mozu followed from the Confucian thoughts, and he proposed that justice should be administered in societies in a human way so that the interests of all people are met. A similar perspective can also be found in Islam, where people are obliged to provide for Allah, each other, and to cultivate well being. Similarly, if you look at Buddhist teachings, it promotes a value of compassion as a means of ending suffering with a focus on human rights in the next life as well as the present moment. There are certain ancient codes such as the Hammurabi Code, teachings of ancient rulers like Menes, Draco, Solon, Manu, for example, from India. And all of these teachings and codes outline standards of conduct for their societies, which existed within limited territorial jurisdictions in those times. Some of these codes have been interpreted as an acknowledgement of human rights. For example, during since 1200 to 300 BC, the scriptures of the ancient Israelites form the basis of the Christian and Muslim thinking. The Ten Commandments, for example, outline the respect for life and for the property of others. The principle that a person is innocent until proven guilty and the tradition of granting asylum originate in Jewish law. During 40 to 100 AD, Christian beliefs taught equality before God. Followers were urged to, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and forgive their enemies. The Greek and Roman empires gave free male citizens certain political rights, and it is therefore important to understand that human rights have originated in different societies and in different points of time, and their development has occurred through moral and religious codes, and in recent centuries, perhaps through legal frameworks as well. Next slide, please. And as we just discussed, human rights is not entirely a concept from the West. It is a crystallization of values which are, common to mankind all over the world. And the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which came into force in 1948, just didn't come out, from nowhere. It is a culmination of all these beliefs, teachings, theories, which have been, which have been going across the world through centuries and even more. And in fact, human rights is the product of, the language that we use in, modern human rights instruments is a product of European countries. But the concept of human rights is as old as the Indian culture itself. The humans expressed their concern towards human rights and fundamental freedom from all since the Vedic ages. In ancient India, the trace of the concept of human rights can be paved back from the Vedic periods of the 15th century, from around 15th century BC, and there are a wide range of stories, pronouncements, teachings, which show that the way, the concept of human rights in Vedas. According to the Vedas, human rights is signified with the concept of equality. The Charter of Equality of all, as defined in the Vedas, is defined in the Vedas in the following words: that no one is superior or inferior, and all should strive for the interest of all, and should progress collectively. The ancient philosopher Kautilya beautifully sums up the concept of a welfare state by saying that the happiness of the state lies in the happiness of its subjects. Under the period, the civil and legal rights were first formulated by Manu, but also added this also added a number of economic rights. From the fact and stories, it is truly revealed that the society under Vedic period was well stimulated and organized and committed towards human rights. As I've already discussed, that human rights has a basis in Buddhism as well as in other religions, for example, in Jainism, Islam, Christianity, and in many various other forms of minor religions as well. So no discussion of human rights, as I said earlier, and their roots in the ancient period is left, is not certainly a Western concept. According to Emperor Ashoka, all men are my, and this is his words, all men are my children, and just desire for my children that they may enjoy every kind of prosperity and happiness within this world and in the next, as also as I desire the same for all men. In fact, King Ashoka worked day and night for the protection of human rights, and subsequently in the later ages, during the Mauryan Empire rule, we see that there has been a gradual, decline in human rights in India. Now, let us come to the modern era of human rights in India, which is basically since the British period and a little before that, actually. Since if you go back to the to the Muslim period in India as well, which is basically the medieval period, there too we saw a certain decline of human rights. There were forms of taxations and oppressions by Muslim rulers, which were discriminatory towards Hindus and other religions. And in the pre-Mughal period, there was a series of social, cultural, political, and religious rights. But with the advent of the Mughals, the Hindus were very stressed in terms of all these rights. But even though the concept of human rights seems to have gotten lost in the dark during this era, we see that there is an advent of human rights once again with the start of Emperor Akbar's reign from 1526 to 1605 AD. And once again, during this period, great regard was given to social, religious, and political rights. And in his religious policy, which was called the Dine Ilahi, which is known as which translates to divine religion, he tried to preach the idea of secularism and religious tolerance. Similarly, during this time, we see the emergence of various Hindu movements, such as the Bhakti movement and the Sufi movement from Islam, and these two made remarkable contribution towards the emergence of human rights, which at times suppressed by the other were suppressed by the other Mughal emperors, including Aurangzeb, Humayun, etc. Next slide, please. So coming to the modern form of human rights jurisprudence in India, as I said, it started with the British rule, and the process of Indian administration started by the Britishers with the introduction of the Regulating Act of 1773. Under it, Indians were suppressed by the Britishers completely in context of social, economical, political, and religious rights in all spheres of their life. They were told that they did not deserve any rights, and basic rights such as rights to life and livelihood, right to freedom, right to expression, right to equality, right to preach, and so much more were denied to us Indians. In such an atmosphere, Indian leaders and freedom fighters, they wanted to break loose of the shackles of British imperialism and colonial rule. So they thought of diverting the fight towards their fight for rights. Perhaps the first explicit demand for fundamental rights appeared in the Constitution of India Bill of 1895. This bill guaranteed that every Indian had the right to expression, the right to equality before law, right to property, right to education, etc. So it was probably the first, of such documents since the British took over India, which kind of goes into establishing the human rights jurisprudence of modern India. Then a series of resolutions were passed between 1917 and 1919 for demanding civil rights and equality. Another major development during this time was drafted by Mrs. Annie Besant, and this came to be known as the Commonwealth of India Bill of 1925. The bill contained a list of 7 fundamental rights, which include liberty of person, freedom of conscience and free profession and practice of religion, free expression of opinion, free elementary education, use of roads, public places, courts of justice, and the like. And sixth, equality before law, irrespective of the consideration of nationality. And lastly, equality of sexes. So this is something we see that came up in the Commonwealth Bill of Rights, that people at that time were advocating for gender equality as well. So, and this goes way back to the 1920 to 1925, when we did not have the UN or any other UN instruments advocating for gender equality or any form of women's rights. In fact, in the Western countries, you will see that during this period, suffragette movements were going on, which meant that women were still fighting for their right to vote and so much else. So India in that regard was fairly forward even in those in those years. The chairman of the Commonwealth of India Bill was Motilal Nehru, and I'm sorry, the resolution, there was a resolution passed in 1927 which came into effect in 1928 with Motilal Nehru as its chairman, and this is known as the Nehru Report. And this declared that its first concern of Indians was to secure the fundamental rights that had been denied to them during the British rule in India. Another achievement that came in context to fundamental rights was the Karachi Resolution, adopted by the Congress session held in March 1931. The decade of the 1940s was generally marked by the emergence of, fundamental rights, subsequently with the Second World War in the backdrop. And this also increased activities related to the UN General Assembly. The further stage of development of fundamental rights in the Indian context was the Sapru Committee report, which was published in 1945. And after independence, various laws have been made from time to time, which has now in today's world, enlarged the concept of fundamental and human rights by covering the entire human race and all forms of rights that can exist. Next slide, please. So in India, when we look at the Constitution of India, which was drafted post, after the British left India and we were an independent country, we find that human rights in the Indian Constitution, in the preamble, as well as to part 3 of the Constitution relating to fundamental rights, and part 4 of the Constitution relating to directive principles. And together, these 3 parts of the Constitution form the core of what is human rights law in India today. And the principles that have been laid out in the preamble have been realized through various provisions, which are explained in part 3 and part 4 of the Constitution. So, as I said earlier, in 1939, when the Second World War broke out, Europe and Great Britain were greatly involved in the war, as we all know. And the constitutional machinery in India was suspended, and the nationalist aspirations of the Indians were suppressed because the British were more concerned with the war ongoing in the West. When the war ended in 1945, the issue of India's independence came up once again and was reconsidered. And after negotiations and discussions, a constituent assembly was set up in 1946 for the purpose of framing the constitution of an independent India. Meanwhile, the Sapru Committee, which was founded in 1945, recognized the importance of incorporating fundamental rights into the Constitution of India. In order to provide justice to the expectations surrounding the Constituent Assembly, it was thoughtfully designed to comprise of men of vast learning and from different walks of life. The Constituent Assembly, which was responsible for framing the Constitution, spent 3 years drafting it. And indeed, the impact of the Second World War and the framing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, as well as the Nuremberg trials, which tried the war criminals of Nazi Germany from 1945 to 1946, these all had an impact and influence in the drafting of the Constitution of India, because all of these highlighted crimes against humanity. Then we had the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950. So all of these together created an impact on the drafting that was ongoing of the for the Constitution of India at that point. So guarantees of fundamental rights by the Constitution in India were, an expected outcome from India's long past of for struggle for freedom. And the leaders of the Indian independence movement attached great significance to the nation building capacities of the state and its duties to establish within India the economic and social conditions necessary for the meaningful exercise of civil and political rights. So we have to understand that fundamental rights or human rights, and whatever term you want to call it, comes in different forms, and these can broadly be classified into civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. And these are in sync with each other. They go in hand with each other. If you are denied civil and political rights, you cannot enjoy economic and social rights, and vice versa. So the Constitution was framed in a manner so that both of these rights, sections of rights could be, exercised harmoniously. And when I said part 3 and part 4 of the constitution earlier, meaning the fundamental rights and directive principles, this is exactly what I meant, because the fundamental rights guarantee the civil and political rights which people in India enjoy, and the directive principles are in the form of recommendations to the state, or the governments, union as well as state governments, to ensure that the conditions are met so that people in India can enjoy their economic and social rights as well. The difference between fundamental rights and directive principles are that the first one, that is the fundamental rights, are justiciable, which is to say that if your fundamental rights are ever infringed, you can go to a court of law and ensure that you can go to a court of law and basically ensure that such infringement is discontinued. Whereas the directive principles of state policy are non-justiciable, because these are in the form of recommendations to the state. You cannot go and secure these, and say that these are my fundamental rights, these aren't my fundamental rights. So you don't have the option of going to court and getting them, courts will not entertain an infringement of directive principles in that sense. But again, it must be said that fundamental rights and directive principles go hand in hand, and this is also exactly what the framers of the constitution wanted. And the constitution was drafted at the time when the deliberations for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were also going on. So all of this, as I said earlier, was influencing the framing of our constitution. However, the UDHR did not, have an enforcement machinery, and as a result of which, there were two subsequent international covenants that came in, which are known as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Both of these came into force in 1966. So because the Universal Declaration is not a treaty, it cannot be enforced. So these two subsequent covenants had to come into force so that the civil and political rights, as well as the economic, social and cultural rights guaranteed in the UDHR, can be adopted by countries in the form of treaties and thereafter be enforced. But much before that, these came into force in 1966. But much before that, the constitution had developed an implementation mechanism for the rights conferred in part 3 and part 4 of the constitution. And the obligation to care was imposed through these fundamental laws of the country and is supplemented and complemented by subsequent legislations on some of these, expanding some of these rights. The Constitution of India prohibits discrimination among citizens on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex or place of birth under Article 15, and ensure equal opportunity to all in matters of public employment under Article 16. Women require special treatment under both these provisions. Next slide, please. The rights contained in Part 3 of the Constitution have been considered by the judiciary, which is considered again as the guardian of the fundamental rights and the Constitution of India. And the judiciary considers the fundamental rights to be paramount, sacrosanct, transcendental, and inalienable and inviolable. Fundamental rights ensure that the individual, his personality, and those things stamped with his personality shall be free from official interference, except where a reasonable basis for intrusion exists. The remedy guaranteed under Article 32 under Part 3 of the Constitution in itself is a fundamental right. So the remedy is to move to court to have your fundamental rights enforced, and that remedy itself, being Article 32 in itself, is a fundamental right. It's not a mere power of the court, but a constitutional obligation on the courts to ensure that fundamental rights are protected and prevented from being infringed. Fundamental rights are said to be, those great and basic rights which are recognized and guaranteed as the natural rights inherent in the status of citizens of a free country. The rights contained in Part 3 are predominantly the civil and political rights, as I discussed earlier, and hence they are phrased in a negative sense and negative terms to prohibit the state from denying or restricting individual liberty, while the directive principles are the aspirations framed to be positive obligations on the state. The Constitution of India guarantees fundamental rights, which can be classified as the right to equality from Articles 14 to 18, right to freedom, Article 19 to 22, right against exploitation, Articles 23 and 24, right to freedom of religion, Articles 25 to 28, and cultural and educational rights from Article 29 and 23. And lastly, as I said, the right to constitutional remedies, which is Article 32. The discussion on the extent of human rights standards incorporated in the Constitution starts with the examination of the civil and political rights, followed by the economic, social, and cultural rights as enumerated in the UDHR, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, in contrast with the Constitution of India. So I'll briefly discuss some of the human rights concepts that have been incorporated in the Indian Constitution from these international mechanisms. For example, the UDHR, amongst others, guarantees the right to life and liberty. The ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as an improvisation to the said right, guaranteed by the UDHR, provides for inherent right to life that cannot be arbitrarily deprived. According to the ICCPR, right to life is to be protected by the law, and any penalty affecting life can only be carried out pursuant to a final judgment rendered by a competent court. Further, persons sentenced to death have the right to seek pardon or commutation of the sentence. Therefore, amnesty, pardon, or commutation of the sentence of death may be granted in all cases. Most importantly, the ICCPR holds that while awarding a death sentence due to recognition to the tender age of persons and motherhood must be given, and in fact it goes to the extent of declaring that sentence of death shall not be imposed for crimes committed by persons below 18 years of age and shall not be carried out on pregnant women. In India, the right to life and liberty is expressly recognized under Article 21 of the Constitution, and the provision seeking pardon or commutation of the offence as provided by the ICCPR is recognized under Article 72 and 161 of the Constitution, which empowers the President of the country and the governor of the states to grant pardon, commute, respite, or remit death sentences. As to the right against sentence of death for the crimes committed by persons below 18 years of age and pregnant women, the Constitution of India does not expressly protect these rights. However, the Code of Criminal Procedure of 1973 gives recognition to the right against sentence of death of pregnant women. We have the Juvenile Justice Act, which protects the case of persons below age of 18 years from imposition of death penalty. Another right under the UDHR and ICCPR is the right against slavery or servitude. Slavery and slave trade is guaranteed by the UDHR, including its prohibition in all forms. Similarly, Article 8 of the ICCPR provides rights against slavery and the slave trade in any form. In addition, the ICCPR holds that no one shall be held in servitude and no one shall be required to perform forced or compulsory labor. Article 23 of the Constitution of India states that trafficking in human beings and begar and other similar forms of forced labor is prohibited. However, the constitution, this provision of the constitution does not make use of the word slavery or slave trade or servitude expressly as mentioned in the International Bill of Human Rights, but forced labor and begar in a wider sense may be seen as a species of slavery. Now, coming to the International Covenant on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Article 2 of the said covenant obligates the state to ensure that all measures to realize the rights recognized in the covenant must be taken progressively, and they are based on the principle of non-discrimination. Among them, the first happens to be a right guaranteed by Article 3 of the EACR. It provides that states must ensure equal right to men and women in enjoyment of all economic, social, and cultural rights set forth in the covenant. Similarly, in India, Article 38, Clause 2 of the Constitution holds that the state must strive to minimize inequalities in income and endeavor to eliminate inequalities in status, facilities, and opportunities, not only amongst individuals but also amongst groups of peoples residing in different areas or engaged in different vocations. This suggests that underpinning on Article 38 is standing, Article 38 is standing on the principle of non-discrimination. Article 6 of the ICEACR recognizes the right to work. And in India, Article 41 of the Constitution provides that the state, within the limits of its economic capacity and development, make effective provisions for securing the right to work. Article 41 proceeds to address education and public assistance in cases of unemployment, old age, sickness, and disablement, and in other cases of undeserved want. And it also states that men and women should equally have the right to employment and income to have a decent life. Next slide, please. So we will see from the several provisions of the Constitution of India that equality between men and women is constitutionally guaranteed. Although in practice, the social relations of gender continue to subordinate women in different walks of life, irrespective of their class, caste, and community, efforts to seek gender equality continue, and they have had historically had close linkages with the women's movements in India, and is marked by the fact that that the women's movements in India have repeatedly appealed to the state as the arbitrator in cases of gender injustice and persistently sought legal reforms and the enactment of new laws on behalf of women. Under the constitutional structure of India, some special references have been made towards women. For example, the 42nd Amendment to the Constitution of India contains a clause referring specifically to women, and it says that it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to renounce practices derogatory to the dignity of women. The 73rd Constitutional Amendment also provides that reservation of 1/3 seats in all tiers of local governments can be made for women. Now, I'll discuss a few cases which have come up before the Honorable Supreme Court of India as well as some other courts, in high courts across the country. For example, in Government of Andhra Pradesh versus P.B. Vijay Kumar, the Honorable Supreme Court held that the state may fix quotas for appointment of women in government services. Under Article 15(3) of the Constitution, both reservation and affirmative actions are permissible in connection with employment or posts under the state. Article 23, as I discussed earlier, deals with the right against exploitation and can also be interpreted to mean that women and girls should also be spared from such exploitation. In the case of Raj Bahadur versus Legal Remembrancer, the Honorable Calcutta High Court held that Article 23 would include to mean trafficking in women and children for immoral or other purposes. Now, I've listed a few laws in India, which supplement the fundamental rights provided in the Constitution of India and furthers the human rights that all people must be guaranteed. And as you can see, some of these laws date back to the early 1900s, when even before India became independent. These include the Child Marriage Restraint Act, the Children Pledging of Labor Act, all having to do with this one, having to do particularly with Article 23. We can see the Immoral Trafficking Act that was passed in 1956, Maternity Benefits Act of 1961. All of these legislations are specifically designed to ensure that basic human rights of women and also the classes for which these acts have been enacted are protected. Coming to part 4 of the Constitution, dealing with the directive policies, principles of state policies, there are several provisions which try to advance the status and stature of women in our society. For example, Article 39 provides that women too, like men, should have equal access to adequate means of livelihood. Equality in the workplace and in employment has been taken up in a number of cases across courts in India. The most significant of them being Vishakha versus State of Rajasthan, which laid down the guidelines to ensure that women were protected from sexually predatory behavior in their workplaces. A few more cases that I'd love to share with all of you is one of them is the Tota Shesharatharma case. I'm sorry, I'm not very, some of these names are very difficult to pronounce. So in this case, this case eliminated permanently the economic disparity between male and female and put a seal of finality on the Hindu female's right to property. So earlier, under the Hindu the personal laws of Hindus, women did not have the right to property, but through this case, women got equal rights like men to access and have rights of ownership of property. In the Bodhisattva case, which was which was decided by the Honorable Supreme Court in 1996, it was held that rape was not only an offense under criminal law, but it is a violation of the fundamental right to life and liberty as guaranteed under Article 21 of the Constitution of India. In state of Punjab versus Gurmeet Singh, again, rape was held to be violative of the right to privacy. So we will see that there are several of these judgments by the state high courts as well as the Supreme Court, which amplifies the right of women in the context of fundamental rights as guaranteed by the Constitution of India, and these rights are ever expanding. So we do hope that almost 70 years down the line, since more than 70 years down the line, almost 75 years down the line since we gained independence, we have certainly progressed, but we cannot say that we are a gender equal country in any terms. So let us hope that there will be being a person from the legal fraternity, I put my full faith on the judiciary in India. And let us hope that in the days to come, there will be actions taken to ensure that women enjoy complete and full, fundamental rights and human rights as guaranteed through the different international instruments as well as the laws in India. Thank you so much. That was it from my end. I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing such relevant information. Now we are open for Q&A session. I request all the webinar participants to post their question in the chat box. As we are in hybrid mode, we also have some questions from the students right here. Can I just read it?
Yes, please do.
Okay. The first question from Shruti Nair is, which country in the world would you say exercises the most equitable human rights, most equitable human rights?
Did you say which country in the world is most equitable in terms of human rights?
Yes.
I'm not sure I know the exact country, but I can definitely say this much that no country in the world can say for sure that they have gender equality in their societies and countries. But I would think that one of the Scandinavian countries, probably Finland, is is quite ahead in terms of the other countries in implementing gender equality. So yeah, that's something I will also have to look up and see which exact country it is that is most equitable.
The second question from the chat box is from Kiran Gupta. Can you share some details about your role as Soroptimist International President's Appeal Coordinator?
Oh yes, I'd love to. Thank you for that question. So I'm not sure whether you have an idea of the structure of Soroptimist International. We are a service organization very similar to Rotary, Inner Wheel, and all of these similar organizations. And we have an international president who comes into office for 2 years, and she starts working on a certain theme. And all Soroptimist clubs across the world are encouraged to, raise funds and donate funds towards this appeal, as we call it, so that the president can carry on working on this theme for the next 2 years that she is in office. So currently, the president of Soroptimist International is Sharon Fisher. She came into office in January 2020. And her theme or appeal is called the Road to Equality, and it encompasses 6 basic themes concerning women, which are old age, child marriage, domestic violence, human trafficking, migration. So these are the 6 things. Did I mention 6? So these are basically the 6 themes that she's looking at addressing. And as her appeal coordinator, I am in charge of finding organizations with whom we can partner to do projects in this appeal, collect funds, talk to Soroptimists across the world so that they understand more about these issues. Oh, there was a 6th topic which I missed out, which is FGM, or female genital mutilation. So all of these issues are issues which are holding back women, and they're not able to go into the wider world, because these are issues which are so basic and striking them at home that it destroys the rest of their lives. So we have tried to focus on increasing education about all of these topics among Soroptimists and beyond. And we've raised funds, and we've started doing some wonderful projects on each of these areas. I'd love to discuss those, but perhaps it would be wiser for me to suggest that you might visit our website and look at the work we are doing, because it's probably going to take me an entire day to explain all the things that we are doing right now.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question we have from here, like, Do human rights apply equally to all countries?
Is that it? Yes. Human rights it applies equally to all persons, irrespective of country, race, religion, whatever it is. It is again a matter of how the respective countries implement those rights, because each country has a different mechanism of implementing human rights. For example, when an international human rights treaty comes into force, some countries will automatically have that law implanted into their national law, whereas some countries like India will has a special process of implementing those laws. Now many countries, when implementing those laws, for example, some of the more rigid countries, for example Saudi Arabia, they will put certain conditions while trying to implement those laws, especially concerning women. So that is when the rights don't become enforced in their completely, and again there becomes a disparity in the enforcement of those rights between different genders or other forms of distinctions. So it is of course up to the country on how they will be implementing those law, but honestly speaking, all these instruments should be applicable equally to all persons across the world, regardless of borders or any other forms of distinction.
Thank you.
Paulumi, I think Rutuja's and Saili's question are more or less similar. You can read both together.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, so the next question is from Saili Pawar. What does the Indian Constitution say about human rights? Whom can an Indian citizen approach in case denied these rights?
Okay, so as I discussed during the session, we don't expressly have something called human rights within the constitutional framework. We do, however, have a law that came into force in 1993, which is called the Protection of Human Rights Law 1993, Protection of Human Rights Act 1993. In the constitution, what I described as the fundamental rights, as well as the directive principles, are mostly what forms the core and basis of human rights law internationally. While the directive principles are not enforceable, that is to say that if they are not implemented, you cannot go to a court of law and complain about it. The fundamental rights are very much enforceable. So if your fundamental rights are infringed, as I said earlier, you have Article 32, which allows you to go to the Supreme Court directly to get your right enforced. Also, we have the provision of Article 226, whereby high courts across the country are empowered to enforce fundamental rights, and citizens, in case of breaches of fundamental rights, can approach these forums to ensure that their rights are enforced.
Okay, so the next question is from Kartike in our class. As we know, there was a recent tragedy in Afghanistan. Almost every human, and especially women, lost their rights. Then, at that situation, what is the solution? What if happened this in India so? So they are supposed to protest or wait for government's announcement.
So, I'm not sure if I should be saying these kind of things on record, but a lot of these actions are actually due to government, policies and approaches. So what happened in Afghanistan, if you go back slightly into the history of the last 20 years and see the US policy after 9/11 and allied subjects topics, you will see that the sudden withdrawal of forces, which led to the crisis in Afghanistan with the Taliban taking over the country, is basically has been caused because the US did not have a very good exit strategy from Afghanistan, and this has led to basically the women and the general people of the country being stressed out and tortured by the Talibans. Now, these are exceptional cases. We've had such instances in other parts of the world as well, and these are things which I believe the world together and international community together has to come together and stop these things from happening. I'm not sure if there is one particular government which can do anything about it. So these are instances of very bad human rights abuse, and these have happened in the past, and there is no guarantee that they will not happen in the future as well. But I think the lack of very strong human rights implementation mechanism across the world is what is causing these situations to spiral out of control. So probably that is what we need, international standard, very strong implementation mechanism to ensure that human rights abuse cannot and do not go on at this rate.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Daphne Pillai, ma'am. Like, do the LGBTQ rights come under human rights?
Well, we do not have a specific reference to the LGBTQ community in under chapter part 3 of the Constitution. But you will know that recently the Supreme Court legalized such relationships under Article 3 under Section 377 of the IPC. So although there is not a specific reference to this community in the Constitution, I think we are moving forward in terms of our thinking and also in terms of our law to acknowledge that they too have rights and those need to be protected. So perhaps in a few more years down the line, we will see a bill coming up which has got to do with protecting the rights of human rights of the LGBTQ community.
Okay, ma'am. The last question is from Nana. The question is, if there any chances in the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act in the COVID times?
Not chances, changes.
Okay, changes in the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act in the COVID times?
No, there hasn't been any changes per se, but obviously we all know that during COVID, domestic violence has shot up the roof, and not just in India but across the world, even in the Western world where we think such instances don't happen. I mean, we've seen some striking instances where very very sad cases of domestic violence has been happening, but this shows that in situations like COVID, we do not have a mechanism where such laws can be more effectively enforced. So I think in the coming years there should be changes in the law, and not just in the law but in the way the laws are. The problem is not so much with the law but the way people try to enforce them. Like, we have many women who are scared to come out and even file a complaint against domestic violence because they do not have a second place to go to, they do not have a second shelter, so they have to just deal with it. So these are the mindsets that we have to change, and we have to make it a more enabling community as a whole, where women can speak about their problems more openly without having to deal with problems such as domestic violence, so that the laws can be thereafter effectively enforced.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for addressing the questions. Now, I request my colleague, Ms. Anjali PV, to propose the vote of thanks. Thank you. Over to you, Anjali.
Good afternoon to all. I am Anjali PV from MBA first year, and it gives me immense pleasure to propose vote of thanks today. I would like to thank Ms. Ayushi ma'am for insightful talk. Ma'am, this webinar has enlightened us regarding our constitution in general and certain specific provision related to women of our country. I also take this opportunity to thank our director, Dr. R. Chandran, for his continuous support and encouragement. Our gratitude to Women Development Committee for facilitating us this webinar. Last but not the least, our beloved faculty, seniors, and batchmates for making this event successful. I wish you all have a great week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ayushi, for your time. And thank you all optimists who have joined us today. I could see Meenakshi, Namrata, Soma, Daphne ma'am, of course, Betty ma'am. Thank you so much for joining in. Thank you, Ayushi. We'll send you a recording if you require it.
Okay. Thank
Ayushi,
you so
your-
much for
yeah.
inviting me. It was
Yeah.
truly an honor to be able to speak to all of you. And thank you, Daphne ma'am, for being here.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did
Thank
you did a fantastic job taking
No,
us through the
I
campuses.
actually had very little time to prepare. So, hi, Yvette. I had very little time
Thank
to
you.
prepare, so I didn't really go according to what I wanted to. But
Okay.
anyway, thank you.
Anuradha
Thank
is
you.
also. Yeah. Thank you. Have a lovely evening. Bye bye. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Bye.
Mamta, thank you so much. Bye bye.